It was July 1st, 1715, when Jonathan Edwards mounted the pulpit of the Northampton Congregational Church in Massachusetts. It would be the last time that he would preach in that church as his official capacity of pastor. Edwards had spent 23 years serving the church faithfully, and now this was the last sermon. In 23 years, a lot of things happen. In 23 years of pastoring this church, all of Edwards' children were born. In 23 years, it was here that he rose to national prominence with his preaching ministry. In 23 years here in this church at Northampton, the fires of the Great Awakening had flamed. One wonders, did he think of all these things when he preached his last sermon? We will never know. Of late, in early 1715, there were divisions and disorders in the church that arose that brought this to a head. There were some in the church, old guards, who never accepted, believe it or not, for 23 years, they never accepted Edwards as their pastor. Rather, holding on to the glory days of the past, to Edwards' predecessor, one Solomon Stoddard, who happened to be Edwards' grandfather. Some in the church did not accept Edwards' position, a strict position on communion. Others did not accept Edwards because of his position on genuine revival and the Great Awakening. There were some vagrant teenagers that got loose, that Edwards actually in one sermon in early 1715 called them out by name from the pulpit. And that didn't help matters with congregational harmony. So all of this came to a head, and then on June 22nd, 1715, the congregation at Northampton had gathered to hear a report given by a committee. The committee's report was on the pastoral relations between Edwards and the Northampton congregation. The committee's recommendation was that 23-year relationship be dissolved. Then the vote came. 23 in favor for him. 238 against him. And so Jonathan Edwards, the prominent figure of America's Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, the author of arguably the most famous sermon in American literature. Jonathan Edwards, the first president of Princeton University and Princeton Seminary, was fired. And so he goes to the western frontier of Pennsylvania and becomes a missionary to Indians. Now, here, Jonathan Edwards has roughly 10 days to prepare his final sermon from June the 22nd to July 1st. What does he do in that week? Well, we know what he does during that week because he has a good friend by the name of David Hall who writes Edward's response to his congregation, who after 23 years of faithful service to them and spending the better part of his physical life laboring for their welfare, has just landed him without a job. David Hall writes about that week between the termination and the final sermon this: Edward's countenance showed no symptoms of displeasure. Rather, he appeared as a man of God whose happiness was out of reach of his enemies. Whose happiness was out of reach of his enemies. Now comes July 1st, the farewell sermon. What does he say? He opens his Bible as he has done faithfully for 23 years. His eyes land upon 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 14 that he takes as his sermon text. He reads the scripture, and during the introduction, he reminds the people how he has spent the prime of his life laboring for their welfare. He has spent the better part of mental and physical part of his life for them. He only briefly speaks of the abyss of sorrow that he has come to know by them. It is not an "I told you so" sermon. He is not going out with guns blazing. Rather, he quickly moves from the contemporary to the eternal. From the time of controversy in 1715 to the time where we must all appear before the great tribunal of Christ. And this is what he says about that moment. All I have known among you for 23 years, we must one day rehearse in a different place. For pastors and the people that have been under their care will meet one another again before the great tribunal of Jesus at the great judgment. There, to give an account to the great judge, the Lord of the church, of their behavior one to another and of the relationship that they have known to each other in this world. Today, we have the distinct joy of ordaining Jonathan Clark as pastor. I hope that his tenure does not end the way Edwards did at the congregation of Northampton, but you never know, nor do I. Nothing is guaranteed in this world. And this morning, as Edwards is our example, but Peter is God's mouthpiece, this is a fitting reminder to remind us of the relationship that we have toward one another as pastor and people. Jonathan is joining myself and Daniel and Mel this year as an elder in this church. And I have found, particularly in today's American evangelicalism, that it is highly important we get this right. Because where a church goes with its leadership, so the church goes, for good or for bad. And if there is, and it is coming like a tidal wave storm, of the reshaping of pastoral ministry, it is the day and age we're living in. I know this. We meet as this church, we do a ministry to local pastors. 50 local pastors from all denominations meet here as good friends of mine 6 times a year, and we talk about the challenges. In the year 2022, in this city, 6 good friends of mine that were pastors are no longer pastors of their churches and are no longer pastors anywhere. They have quit. They have stopped, and they're all younger than me, and they all been in the church less time than I have. This is coming in the church, and so it is imperative that if we want a faithful gospel church advancing to our culture, we must have faithful, godly leaders to lead the church to do this. This is incumbent on what we do today. And so it will do no well to cite polls or opinions, but we all must submit to the Holy Scriptures. And thus comes Peter. Interestingly, Peter gives Jonathan, and a reminder to myself of what our jobs are, our job as pastors. And this is what I'd like to charge Jonathan, although experience will teach you this. It's a brutal teacher. First, Peter presents in verse 1 and 2 the job of a pastor. Or to say it this way, the function of a faithful, and that's the operative term. That's what we're going for, faithfulness. I have been at Calvary for 19 years, going into my 19th year. I have seen just in this city, flavors of the month rise up, trendy stuff rise up, and it comes crashing down, and now it's on the ash heap of church history. We must have faithfulness, not necessarily cutting edge, freshness. We must have faithfulness. So the fable of the tortoise and hare is a good parable for pastors, is we must have faithfulness. And so Peter, as we progress, you'll see the operative attribute, faithful pastors. In season and out of season, like the oak in our parking lot, we must have faithful pastors. The function of a faithful shepherd, Peter tells us, is willing, eager service. Now, right out of the gate, Peter gives a command. It's an action. It's a verb where he says, shepherd. And so that we understand the metaphor, he then follows that up with the flock of God. And he'll say that again in verse 3. So the metaphor Peter is using, and of all people it's appropriate, Peter would use it, right? Peter, do you love me? Then shepherd my flock. And Peter now passes it on to the church tradition of how they would select their elders by saying, do your job and shepherd the flock of God. This is a good reminder, Jonathan, for both of us, that this church is not our own ultimately. It is God's flock. And He alone on His resume deserves that quality because He shed His blood for her. And we are called to shepherd it. As the text unfolds later, particularly as verse 4 comes out, we are the under shepherds. He is the chief shepherd, literally the big boss man. He owns it, and we are called to shepherd it. For all the titles I am given, and it depends on the context. So I teach, at seminary, and my students every day call me Dr. Albert. My wife does not call me Dr. Albert, but my students do. In other contexts, I'm called Reverend Albert. I think Jerry Howell is the only human being on the planet who calls me Brother Brian. But every time I hear the term Pastor Brian, it is an endearing reminder of what my role is. Because the term pastor is the noun form of this word. So if you, for example, went to Ephesians 4, he gives pastors, teachers. It's the same word for shepherd. A pastor is a shepherd. And so shepherding is the task we are called to do. I have in my kitchen, Anita puts it up this time of the year actually, as I go out to my garage to leave, a print of a shepherd. And he's out in the snow, and he's feeding his sheep that are thoroughly dependent on the shepherd to survive. It's a blizzard. So the shepherd has to get up in the wee hours of the morning. The sheep aren't going to feed themselves. The shepherd has to open the gate, open the barn, get the food, groom the sheep, even the ones that bites them. He still grooms them. Everything for their survival is dependent on the shepherd. Sheep do not do well on their own. And so if a sheep errantly gets their head stuck in a fence, they're not going to get themselves out. It's the shepherd. The shepherd has to feed. And this is in part why Paul, so often when he described the pastor, used the metaphor of a farmer. It's every day doing the same thing, feeding, tending, guiding, protecting, healing, leading, and all sorts of other responsibilities. This is what Peter means, of course, when he says serving as overseers. We oversee, we watch over the flock, not as dictators and tyrants, not barking orders from afar, but Peter says we serve them. We serve. Now, what follows in the rest of the text is a series of negatives followed by positives. Don't do it this way, not do it this way. So, okay, how do we serve as pastors? What are you called to do to shepherd this flock? How do you do it? First of all, you don't do it, Peter says, by compulsion. The only time this adverb appears in all of the Bible. But we know what compulsion means. It's sort of a graphic term. That Jonathan and I and Daniel and Mel and whoever comes behind us as elders are never to lead you by force. That is to say, we're not to be coerced to do it. Jonathan's arm should not be twisted to serve. And of course, one of the reasons we have this public service is because everything that has happened with Jonathan to this point has been done in public. So we have been all the way inspecting his life, as we have every right and responsibility to do. So several years ago, this young couple from Louisiana came up, and they became students at seminary and interns in this church. We have a pastoral internship, and Jonathan became our intern, I think during COVID. And so we got to know this couple very well, and we got to see him up close. We got to see everything from how he deals with people to how does he teach. And all of this is right to do in the public arena. And then they landed here, and over the years we've got to see Jonathan and how he treats Morgan and how he treats others and how he treats the Word of God. And about a year and a half ago, some of you came and said, what about Jonathan as an elder? And so the elders convened, as you have asked us to do, and we usually take a year. A lot of questions. Everything from his personal life, to his marriage, to his habits, to his theology, to what he thinks presently about the church, to future scenarios. We try to leave nothing undone as elders. And then, of course, we present him to you, and you, as you did a few weeks ago, overwhelmingly affirmed him as an elder in our church. This is right to do because it allows us to see his life. And it is a life, Peter says, not compelled by force. The author of Hebrews has a scenario where he is talking to the church about how to treat their pastors. And it's sort of we can eavesdrop into their conversation. This is how you make a pastor happy. Happy pastors are like happy wives, right? Happy wife, happy life. The last thing a church wants is to have a miserable pastor. But there's a way that you can or can avoid it. And the author of Hebrews gives good advice. Obey those who rule over you and submit, for they watch over your souls. They watch over your souls as those who give an account. There is a day coming that some days puts the fear of God in me, where I must stand before Jesus Christ, and he'll hit the rewind button and say, Brian, let's talk about how you shepherded my flock. Let them that are the pastors do this with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable to you. Could you imagine if I stood up today at Calvary Baptist Church and said, you know, Calvary, I really don't want to be here today, but I got to get a paycheck? Could you imagine if I said that, how that would absolutely shred any relationships that I would have with you? You would say, well, you know, we could kind of make that happen with alternative measures. No church wants a pastor that feels compelled to be here, nor should a church deserve one. Peter, or Hebrews, tells us there's a way you can make sure you make your pastor happy, but Peter here says, Jonathan, you serve this congregation, but you don't serve it by having someone put a gun to your head, by having your arms twisted. A number of years ago, when I first came to Calvary and we transitioned to elders, in that very first election, we had several men that were nominated. That was a challenging moment for me because I didn't have an elder group to depend on. I sort of had to do this solo. And thankfully, the congregation in my mind comported with who these men should be. But I remember one gentleman at the time, godly man, a good man. His name was nominated, and I asked him, have you ever considered being an elder? And his response repeatedly was, well, it's really whatever the church wants. Well, that's really not what I'm asking you. I'm asking, do you want to? Well, it's really whatever the church wants. And I got the same response, and I thought, I really don't want to be serving with this guy, because I don't know if he really wants this. And I don't want it affecting me because I really want this. And so I decided it was wise not to push him on because I'm not sure he really wanted to be. Peter says here, we must serve not under compulsion. Or as Paul says in Timothy, a man should desire the office of an overseer, and if he does, he desires a good thing. Quickly, we also get another negative, not for dishonest gain. Another adverb that's only mentioned here in Scripture. Now, one can say we can just move along because we're not paying Jonathan. He won't be tempted to do this for money. And to some degree, I do laugh at this sort of dishonest gain issue. I have been in pastoral ministry now for 28 years. I have never met a guy that gets into the ministry so he can be a millionaire. If he does, he's an imbecile. I am sure there are guys that do get rich. We hear them all the time, but part of me chuckles at a verse like this. I mean, you're going in the ministry to try to make it's not going to happen. You'll never be paid what you're worth. You get degrees. Compare the degree you have with someone in the secular world. You'll never be paid in the ministry what you're worth, and that is the point. We're not about the love of money, but apparently some were, else we would not have this here. What's interesting in the New Testament when Peter and Paul deal with this greed for money or greed for power, every single time, without exception, it is always linked to the distortion of message that man has to give in order to get rich. That is to say, if a man wants to get rich or wants to use the church to make money or get power, he will have to distort the message of the gospel to do it. He'll have to deal with loose and fast with the Word of God. He'll have to avoid certain things. He'll have to tickle certain ears. Every single time in the New Testament, when the apostles bring up the love of money or the lust for money with a pastor, it's always connected to the distortion of the gospel message. That's how you do it. Paul, for example, in Titus, right after he gives the qualifications of an elder in Titus 1, he follows that up to an exhortation with Titus. And he says, Titus, there are some in your community of Crete whose mouths must be stopped, because they're subverting whole houses, teaching things which they ought not to for the sake of dishonest gain. Teaching things which they ought not in order to get rich. And so Peter's warning is good. It's good for us today to follow up on the positives of both of these, not for compulsion, not for dishonest gain, is the language but eagerly or but willingly. Imagine if I go home tonight and I ring the door of my house, which I never do. I just go in, I own the house. But I ring the door and Anita comes to the door and I have a dozen roses for her. And I say, hey, sweetie. And she says, well, you didn't have to do, it's not our interview, you didn't have to do that. And I said, well, I'm your husband, it's my job, I have to. What do you think she's going to react? No, she wants to know that she stands in a special class all to herself. She wants to know that I want to do this. This is something that I like doing, saying I love you and doing these things. And so it is, Peter says, in the relationship between pastor and people, that this is a job, a calling, a life that we get to do it, not that we have to do it, that we want to be here, not that we have to. This brings us to the second component of a faithful shepherd. That is, the life of a faithful shepherd must be exemplary. Here we come to verse 3, where Paul says, not domineering those in your charge, or literally not being lords over it, but being an example to the flock. Unless you have been on the planet Mars for the last week, we have seen some interesting things develop in the House of Representatives. A lot of things on display, but I won't get into the politics. That's not what we're here for. But one sub-theme or dominant theme, depending on how you look at it, of this process, and whatever you think about it, is the issue of leadership. Leadership is at stake. What kind of a leader do we want? Do we not want? Notice that in the Holy Scriptures that Christ judges leaders in the church differently than in the world. For example, if we went to the qualifications of the elders that are mentioned both in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus 1, we'll never hear that we're to judge Jonathan the way we're to judge perhaps how you get a job in the secular marketplace. We're never told, for example, that Jonathan must have a certain IQ to be an elder. We're never told that he has to have a certain level of experience in the company to be an elder. We're never told that he has to be a certain age to be an elder. We're never told he has to have a fat resume. We're never told he has to have a certain personality type. All things that we're told is a success of a great leader in today. In fact, if we look at the qualifications of an elder, they are extraordinary in that they are not that extraordinary. If you look at the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, you'll find that there are qualifications mentioned for every Christian. The pastor is not some super distinct body that are less sinful and greater and were born that way and all you do is sprinkle holy water and poof, you have an elder. That is not how it... Elders are the exemplary of every Christian. For example, in the qualifications, an elder must be hospitable. Does that mean that you all do not have to be warm and friendly to people because you're not an elder? Of course not. An elder is not to be quarrelsome. Does that mean that you all can get in barroom fights and be okay? Of course not. That's the point of the qualifications. This is the model Christian, the exemplary Christian. This is someone that you can teach your kids. Here's what godliness looks like. Not perfection, but here's what a godly man looks like. So the elders should be the model believers, not lords over it, but examples. This is the tough task, Jonathan. You thought the last 3 years you were in the public inspection, and particularly this last year, heavy examination. Our lives are always open for inspection. Our lives are always, that's how we lead. We do not bark orders from the flock. We lead by example. Our lives should be looked at by our sheep, and they say we can follow that. Everyone, or a lot of people, want to be a leader. A lot of people think, as Peter says, is not going to happen. You can't lord it, is that if you bark orders loud enough, you're a leader. Leadership is all about influence. The quickest way you'll know you're a leader or not is look behind you and see if anyone's following. If no one's following, you're not a leader, no matter what you call yourself. You're just out walking in the park. Peter says that we are to be examples to the flock of God. And finally, the reward of a faithful shepherd is permanent glory. In verse 4 we read, "And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away." This is both trepidatious and liberating. It's fearsome in the fact there is a date on God's calendar where I and you and Daniel and Mel in this season of this church's life will have to give an answer for how we treated the flock. That day is coming. But it's equally comforting to know, because there are some days where no one is going to thank you. No one's going to pat you on the back. There are going to be some days when sheep do what sheep do. They don't have all the information you have. You will have information about a lot of people's private lives that they will not. And they will judge your motives inaccurately, oftentimes. They will also see your blind spots, my blind spots, areas of sanctification we need to grow up on. And some days, brother, the only thing that's going to get you through is the fact alone that Christ has called you to do this. I think this is part what Peter is getting at. When the chief shepherd appears, he's going to be the one to reward you with a job well done. This is a great calling, but it's a high and holy calling, that we are men between two worlds. One foot is caught in this world, and another is caught in another. We are doctors of the soul, laboring in a tough world to be a pastor. Just in the fall of last year, USA Today, I always clamor for it, gives their top 25 most stressful jobs. Pastor was number 3 on that list in America, next to emergency responders and police officers. There is no wonder that 6 of my friends said goodbye. It is a stress job, not because of things that they deal with that's stressful on their jobs, because this is soul care. We are laboring between heaven and hell, between eternity and the temporal. And to use one more personal word before we close this brief time in the Word, I am so thankful to know you. You have ministered to me in this church countless times. I really believe in one of the, now this is just between us, don't tell them. One of my selfish reasons for bringing on guys to be an elder is to help me be a better pastor. And I think we found that in you, that you will help me be a better pastor to them because of your faithfulness and your love for the body. I would close with another vignette. I began with Jonathan Edwards. I would close with another pastor. This quotation is in your bulletin if you care to know. It's fully cited. You can actually go to this sermon by Edward Griffin, a Baptist. In another era, he faithfully for decades pastored his church. He was growing old and he was growing blind, poor eyesight. His voice was giving out. Remember, this is before microphones. And the time of his retirement came. His physical limitations forced that issue, not a disgruntled church. And Edward Griffin had what rarely happens in churches. He got to be around for his successor. He actually groomed his successor. And the church got to see his successor long before Edwin Griffin called it quits. But the day came when the new pastor would be installed, and the church asked Edwin Griffin to preach the installation sermon, which would be, in effect, his last sermon as pastor. And I believe he pastored that church, if I'm not mistaken, for 38 years. The sermon becomes known as a tearful farewell from a faithful pastor. I do not believe he titled it that way, but it was published later under that time. And the last paragraph of his last sermon, he turns from the candidate to the congregation. And so as we close this sermon, I turn from the candidate to the congregation. For your own sake and your children's sake, cherish and revere him whom you have chosen to be your pastor. Already he loves you, and he will soon love you as bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. By the way, this is going to be hard for me to get through without editorial comments. Only a pastor can say that, and you'll know if you're a pastor what he means. I'm not trying to be condescending. The longer a pastor goes in a congregation, and I hope you'll understand what I mean in this way. Next to marriage and next to my kids, the closest relationship I have is with you, bar none. I would be happy to give everything up in my life today, but it would be gut-wrenching to give you up. So he's right when he says this. Bone of, I know it's hard to even think it's hyperbole. A faithful pastor absolutely believes this, as did Edwards, by the way. It will be equally your duty and your interest to make his labors as pleasant to him as possible, i.e. Hebrews. So Edwin gives some free advice. Do not demand too much. I don't know what that means. He specifies, do not require visits too frequently. Should he spend in this way half the time, which some demand, he must wholly neglect his duties. That is a wise pastor. Again, that is a wise pastor. You know, everyone can do this, but only one person does this every Sunday. So you better give him time to do this. Because what you hear from this Sunday to Sunday, that's where the church goes, I guarantee you, for good or bad. So, do not demand too much, or he'll sink under the burden. I think that's in part why we're going to find in the next 10 years a lot more younger pastors are saying goodbye to the ministry. I firmly believe that. I'm not saying that as a prophet or proudly. I firmly believe it as I talk to guys under the age of 30 into the pastorate, why they're stressed out. Do not report him to all the unkind things which may be said against him. And I would add, particularly on Sunday morning before he preaches. Nor frequently in his presence allude to opposition, if opposition should arise. And then here is a good reminder. Though he is a minister of Christ, consider that he has the feelings of a man. He is mortal. He is mortal.